Okay, brothers and sisters, let's go over some of the common gotchas that students run into when programming functions, okay? So hopefully by now you've seen the video where we created the program from the reading, specifically the program to calculate the volume of a triangular prism, okay? So we've got that coded program up here on the left. Here are some of the gotchas that students encounter when learning to write functions. Okay, gotcha number one. You'll notice that a function has a couple different parts. It's got the function keyword, it's got a name, it's got a list of what are called parameters inside of parentheses, and then it's got an open and closing curly brace, just like an if statement or a loop statement, okay? So a common gotcha that students run into very first is a function accepts three pieces of the input, A, B, and C, okay? So sometimes students will accept input into their functions, but then they will automatically overwrite the values that were passed in with new values. Okay, this is invalid because whoever is calling our function, in this example, the prism volume function is calling our function. It has specific values that it wants the triangle area function to act on. Okay, and when we overwrite, or when we do something like this, we are overwriting the values that were passed in. It's sort of like if someone hands you an instruction sheet to go learn how to buy a home, for example. They give you the instruction sheet that has step A, step B, step C, substep D1, substep D2, right? So that list of instructions is just completely disregarded and you overwrite their list. That's what's happening when we pass in arguments to fill the parameters or actual values, and then we overwrite them. So don't do this, okay? Just use the values that were handed to you by the caller of your function. Okay, another thing about these parameter lists. So the parameters are called, they're just like variables. They have a name, they will have a value, A, B, and C. It's a common misconception that you have to actually create a variable called A, B, and C in order to pass in those values into a function. As you can see here, I have a variable called side1. Side1, when line 10 is executed, is filled with a value because we go to the document and find a text box named text side1, grab its value, and then parse it to a floating point number. So side1 is a variable, right? But I take the value that is stored in side1 and I pass it into the prism volume function. When I do that, I'm basically saying take the value that is in side1, ship it over to the prism volume function, where that value will be stored in a variable called A, right? I do not have to make sure that the names match, right? I don't have to say A from the function call site is the same variable name as A in the function definition. I could name this whatever I wanted to it, right? For example, I could call it banana stand, right? I could do anything I want. So please know that function or that parameter names do not need to match from the call site where arguments are provided. Okay, another issue that I've seen all semester long for every course that I've ever taught is when we're calling functions, we call a function, we use one name in the function definition, but then we use a different name when we're trying to call the function, okay? So something like this perhaps, right? Function names at the call site need to exactly match word for word and casing the function that you're trying to call. So you need to make sure that if you're calling a function called do prism volume, there actually needs to be a function called doPrismVolume. In this case, we probably just meant to call the prism volume function. And Notepad++ and Visual Studio Code, if we double-click the function name, shows us, it highlights anywhere we are referring to the prism volume. So if I have doPrismVolume like this, and I double-click it, I'm expecting to see this be highlighted here, but it isn't because they are not the same function. So please watch for that. Okay, another gotcha is I want to call this function, and I use the name correctly, but I don't provide the arguments to fill my parameter list. So JavaScript is very forgiving, but JavaScript also is too forgiving, okay? Because a variable can actually hold the entire definition of a function, right? So we've just created a variable that doesn't hold a number, it doesn't hold a string, it actually holds a reference to a function. So you could then do something goofy like this. Okay, so just make sure when you're calling a function that you always provide the parameter list. Otherwise, you are just going to store a reference to a function in a variable rather than calling the function and getting the return value from the function. Those are some common gotchas when working with functions.